a couple of weeks ago that my oldest grandson graduated from Montgomery Bell. And it was very nice when they had their honors night that he was recognized. And they read what the honor was about and why, and it was in the name of General Frank Maxwell Andrews. Now, my wife is pretty proficient with her smartphone. By the time Andrew had come up, collected his award, and walked down off the stage, she had already Googled and pulled up Frank Andrews. And that's the first I knew. He was from Nashville. He was a Nashville. And not only that, he graduated from MBA in 1901. So obviously I was pretty ignorant about one of our local heroes. Well, I also, thinking about General Andrews and his illustrious career and being from Nashville, one person I knew most familiar with Nelson Andrews was Ken Roberts. So I called Ken just to ask, was this general related to the Nelson Andrews most of us know or knew? And he said, sure, it was his uncle. And Ken went on to say, I have got a program that Nelson did on his uncle, and if I can find it, I'll make it available to you. So I got that about 9:30 this morning. But anyway, Andrews was born in Nashville in 1884, graduated from MBA in 1901, as I said. He went to the military academy and graduated in 1906 and entered the cavalry, which of course was a popular thing to do. Now, in World War I, he did not go overseas, but right at the end of the war, he replaced General Billy Mitchell as the officer assigned to the occupation of Germany. So, also, as far as General Andrews, Henry Allen, and General Henry Allen made no secret of the fact he didn't much like the idea of his son-in-law being an aviator. It was too dangerous, and he didn't want his daughter to be losing her husband. And at that time, there was effectively an edict that a officer could not fly militarily. I mean, they could fly, but not as a military mission. So anyway, along with several other pretty familiar names, our local General Andrews is a recognized leader in what has eventually become the Army Air Force as a separate branch. And those other names are General Henry Hap Arnold, General Carl Spaatz, and General Ira Eaker. I didn't know about him, but I did look him up on Wikipedia. He was a noted general. Anyway, Andrews progressed through various posts in the 1930s. He'd got his wings, I should have said, I think in 1918. He was 34 at the time, so he was a late flyer, but an enthusiastic one. During the 1930s, he rose through several appointments to be commander of General Headquarters Air Force. This was in 1935. At that time, the Air Force, or what there was of an Air Force, was extremely fragmented. They'd have one section that was just training, and they'd have a section that, okay, you could fly in combat, but it was a very controversial thing. Most of the old timers in the military didn't think much of these newfangled airplanes. Many of them would refer to them as simply spotters or eyes of the artillery. Send them out to find out where the artillery should shoot. Now, the struggle over the future and the control of the air arm went on for a number of years. The Secretary of War didn't like it at all, and Andrews is coming along, and he, along with Billy Mitchell and others, are very strong vocal proponents of a very effective and centralized Air Force. Andrews was particularly a proponent of the heavy bombers, and most specifically the B-17 Flying Fortress. From his standpoint, this was the way to go. They had long range, they could go out, they could demoralize the enemy, and even better still, they could knock out the enemy airplanes and come back home and we'd be safer. So his outspoken views and many of his public statements kind of got him in trouble with some of the brass. Even one tiff with MacArthur, where he had testified before what was to be a secret committee. Somebody leaked whatever he had said in his plain-spoken way, and MacArthur didn't back him up. So that was kind of a split between the two of them. Some of his comments were that the U.S. was at best a 5th or 6th rate air power in the world, and there was no coordination between air, ground, and sea power. So with this, he was, after he finished his appointed period as head of this GHQ Air Force, he was pretty well sent off to oblivion in San Antonio. And, but somewhere along the way, good relationship. He took General George Catlett Marshall on a tour around the country showing the various operations that existed at the time and explained to him his vision for what air power could do in this country. Even one tiff with MacArthur, where he had testified before what was to be a secret committee. Somebody leaked whatever he had said in his plain-spoken way, and MacArthur didn't back him up. So that was kind of a split between the two of them. Some of his comments were that the U.S. was at best a 5th or 6th rate air power in the world, and there was no coordination between air, ground, and sea power. So with this, he was, after he finished his appointed period as head of this GHQ Air Force, he was pretty well sent off to oblivion in San Antonio. And, but somewhere along the way, he had formed one good relationship. He took General George Catlett Marshall on a tour around the country showing the various operations that existed at the time and explained to him his vision for what air power could do in this country. He was obviously impressed, not only with his plan, but with Andrews himself. And then along comes somewhat of a surprise move that Marshall was moved over several other more likely candidates and became Chief of Staff. Well, shortly after that happened, Andrews was brought out of his exile and made commander. Well, let's see, he went to the General Staff for a short period of time. Then he was commander of the Caribbean Defense Command. And in 1940, he was on the front page of Time magazine and referred to as the defender of the ditch. That's Panama Canal. Since Andrews had handled his demotion and whatever with such grace and whatever, he continued to be very much in favor with most everybody, and those that weren't in favor or didn't hold him in favor kept quiet. So his progress went pretty much upwards at a rapid rate from then on. And also, soon after he received his increased appointment, FDR approved the production of the B-17 Flying Fortress, which had been pretty much suppressed prior to that time. Okay, in January 1943, Andrews represented his command at the Casablanca Conference. And of course, the Casablanca Conference was kind of the beginning of the planning for the invasion of Europe. And being a favorite at that point, he was also named, Andrews was named, commander of the U.S. European Theater of Operations. Now at this point, things got a little fuzzy in what I was reading. I read 3 or 4 different sources. One of them said that in that appointment, that Andrews was picked over Eisenhower. Another one I read said that he replaced Eisenhower, or so came after Eisenhower. So I'm not sure what the truth of the matter is, but it was obvious that his star was rising very rapidly, and his ability to manage and organize was being recognized. And as a matter of fact, General Hap Arnold remarked in his memoirs that there was no doubt in his mind that had he lived, he Andrews, would have been the supreme commander rather than Eisenhower. So anyway, from January 43 until his death, Andrews was actively engaged in the planning and logistics and whatever for the invasion. It was only in May of 1943, Andrews was on a B-24 flying from London to Washington for a meeting when the B-24 flew into a hillside in Iceland, killing him and everyone on board except the tail gunner, who survived. So here the report that I read that Nelson Andrews had prepared about his uncle, Uncle Maxwell as he called him, it's kind of an element of intrigue. Nelson refers to the fact that his father, who was also a military man, that's Nelson's father, was pretty well convinced that sabotage was involved in the unfortunate crash of that B-24. Now, everything else I read did not refer to it except Nelson's report. Now, Nelson went on to point out that after Andrews' untimely death and being in such an important position, that there was so very little said about it, very little news, and it was almost like he just kind of ceased to exist rather than being the first lieutenant general to die in the war, someone who had such an important position. And there is probably speculation that maybe it could be attributed to the fact that during that period when there was such great concern about morale and whatever, that there was a suppression of bad news and an idea to emphasize everything that was good news. So the bad news about General Andrews was just kind of overlooked. And Nelson also makes reference to someone in the chief of staff line, a colonel, came to visit his father twice and told him, be quiet about this. So that, obviously raised Nelson's concern and whatever. But anyway, I get down to the point of saying that when you read and hear and think about the strength of character, and the capabilities and the accomplishments of this gentleman, I'm even more proud of my grandson receiving a recognition in the name of Lieutenant General Frank Maxwell Andrews.